the Sumerian tablet that explains why you are afraid of things that haven't happened. In November 1872, a 32-year-old man was sitting in a second-floor room at the British Museum in London. He was surrounded by hundreds of clay fragments spread across a long wooden table, fragments that had been shipped back from the ruins of Nineveh in Iraq a quarter of a century earlier, packed in crates, unloaded, catalogued, and largely ignored. Most of them contained what you would expect: administrative records, tax ledgers, lists of livestock and grain, the kind of thing that keeps a civilization running, but does not exactly set your heart racing on a Tuesday afternoon in Victorian England. The man's name was George Smith. He had left school at 14. He was not a professor. He was not a trained archaeologist. He had been a banknote engraver. He had taught himself cuneiform during his lunch breaks by coming to this same museum every single day and sitting with the tablets until the language started to make sense. And on this particular afternoon in November 1872, he picked up a fragment, held it in front of him, and started reading. And then he stood up. And according to the colleagues who were in the room with him that day, he began removing his clothing, not metaphorically, literally. He started taking his clothes off, running around the room, shouting. The colleagues who witnessed it wrote about it afterward. They were not sure whether to intervene or applaud, because what George Smith had just read, pressed into a piece of clay that had been sitting in a museum crate for 25 years, was a question so specific, so direct, so completely unambiguous in what it was asking, that a man who had dedicated his life to reading ancient languages completely lost his composure in a room full of Victorian academics. And that question was this: why are we afraid of things that have not happened to us yet? Why does the knowledge that something will eventually happen destroy a person more completely than the thing itself ever could? The tablet was part of what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh, and what was written on it has never stopped being true. Let us be clear about what Gilgamesh actually was before any of the mythology gets in the way, because the mythology is the part that makes people think this is an ancient story about something that does not apply to them. Gilgamesh was a king, a real one. He ruled the city of Uruk around 2700 before Christ. The city walls he built are still partially visible in the archaeological record of southern Iraq. He is listed in the Sumerian king list as the 5th king of Uruk after the flood. He had a mother who was described as divine and a father who was described as mortal, which in the language of the ancient world was a way of saying he was exceptional in ways that exceeded normal human capacity. He was 2/3 god and 1/3 human, according to the tablet's own description, which is also a way of saying he was the kind of person who could do things most people cannot, but was still fundamentally subject to the thing that ends all human stories, regardless of how exceptional you are: death. He had a best friend named Enkidu, and Enkidu died. And that is where the story the tablet is actually telling begins, because Gilgamesh had lost people before. He was a king. Kings lose people. But Enkidu was different. Enkidu was the one person in Gilgamesh's life who matched him completely, his equal, the only person the king had ever met who was genuinely his peer in every way that mattered. And when Enkidu died, something happened to Gilgamesh that the tablet describes in language so precise and so uncomfortable that it is difficult to read without recognizing yourself in it. He did not grieve in the way that ancient kings were supposed to grieve. He did not perform the rituals and move on. He sat beside the body of his friend for 7 days and 7 nights and refused to accept what had happened. And then when the reality could no longer be denied, he did not go back to ruling his city. He walked away from everything, into the wilderness, alone. And the reason he gives in the tablet for this is the thing that should make you stop and sit with it for a moment. He was not weeping for Enkidu, he was weeping for himself, because for the first time in his life, looking at the body of his dead friend, Gilgamesh understood that the same thing was going to happen to him, not someday, in an abstract sense, actually, specifically, him. And that knowledge, the knowledge of a thing that had not yet happened and might not happen for years or decades, destroyed him more completely than any enemy he had ever faced on a battlefield. The tablet is describing the specific human malfunction of being paralyzed, not by what is happening, but by what might happen. and a Sumerian scribe pressed the clinical description of it into clay 4,000 years ago, before psychology existed as a field, before anyone had given it a name, before anyone had written a single paper about why human beings are uniquely capable of being incapacitated by imaginary futures. Now here is what most people do not know about the Epic of Gilgamesh, because most people who have heard of it know the broad strokes. King, friend dies, quest for immortality. Flood story, snake steals the plant, goes home. The end. What gets lost in that summary is the specific nature of what Gilgamesh was actually experiencing between the death of Enkidu and the moment he decided to go looking for immortality. The tablet describes it in detail that is not comfortable to read. He wandered in the wilderness, wearing the skins of lions he had killed because he could not face going back to the city he ruled. He stopped eating. He stopped caring about his appearance. He describes himself in the text as restless, as unable to sleep. He says he lay down on the earth and then rose again, and could not be still. He says he was filled with a sorrow he had never felt before and did not know how to carry. And all of this was not caused by grief for his friend. The grief was there, but underneath it was something else, a specific kind of terror that the Sumerians understood well enough to document with clinical precision. Gilgamesh was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of the fact that he was going to die. Those are not the same thing. Dying is an event. The knowledge that you are going to die is a condition. It is something you carry every day from the moment you understand it until the moment the thing finally happens. And what the tablet is recording is the exact moment that knowledge broke through into Gilgamesh's conscious understanding and what it did to him when it did. He was, by every measure the ancient world had for greatness, the greatest human being alive. He had built walls, he had killed monsters, he had walked into a forest guarded by a demon and come out the other side, and none of that helped. The moment the knowledge arrived, it did not care about any of it. It sat in his chest like a stone, and it did not move. And that, the tablet is saying very quietly to anyone paying attention, is not a weakness specific to Gilgamesh. That is the condition. That is what it is to be human, even the greatest one who ever lived. George Smith presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London on December 3rd, 1872. The room he stood in contained the British Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a former banknote engraver in a room full of the most powerful and educated men in England, and he read them what he had found. What caught the world's attention in 1872 was the flood story, the parallels with Genesis, the sensation of a biblical narrative appearing in a clay tablet that predated the Bible by over 1,000 years. That was what made the newspapers. That was what made the Daily Telegraph fund an expedition back to Nineveh so Smith could find the missing fragments. And he did find them. 5 days into his excavation in May 1873, he located the piece that completed the flood account. He telegraphed the news back to London. It made headlines around the world. The story of the flood predating the Bible was the story of 1872, but sitting inside the same epic, in the tablets that followed the flood account, was the other story, the one that did not make the front pages, the one that did not shock Victorian religious sensibility, the one that described a king walking alone in a wilderness, unable to eat or sleep, wearing lion skins, terrorized by the knowledge of his own mortality. That story did not cause a sensation in 1872 because it did not threaten anyone's theology, but it was the more honest document. It was the one that described something every human being alive has felt, and most of them have never been able to name properly. George Smith died 4 years after his discovery. He was 36 years old. He was on his third expedition to Nineveh when he contracted dysentery in Aleppo and died. The man who discovered the oldest written record of human fear of death died young in a foreign city on his way back to a dig site. The irony is not subtle. Gilgamesh eventually finds Utnapishtim, the one human being the gods had granted immortality. He lives at the edge of the world with his wife, beyond the waters of death, in a location that the tablet describes in terms that map to no known geography. To reach him, Gilgamesh has to pass through absolute darkness, through mountains that have never seen sunlight, through the waters of death that no living person has ever crossed. He does all of this alone, and when he finally arrives and sits in front of the one person who might have an answer to the question that has been destroying him, what does Utnapishtim say? He does not say what Gilgamesh needs to hear. He says what is true. He says that the gods established death for humanity when they created them. They kept life for themselves. That was the arrangement. It was not an accident. It was not a flaw in the design. It was a deliberate decision made by the divine order, and there is nothing Gilgamesh or any other human being can do to reverse it. And then Utnapishtim does something that is either cruel or kind, depending on how you look at it. He tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth, not immortality, youth, not living forever, just not being old when you die. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet and sinks himself to the bottom of the ocean and finds it. He holds it in his hands. He has the thing, the only thing a mortal can recover from the divine order that refused to share its immortality, and he stops to rest and bathe in a cool pool on the way home. And a snake smells the plant and steals it while Gilgamesh is in the water. The snake sheds its skin as it disappears. The Sumerians believed snakes were immortal because they shed their skin and appeared renewed. The one thing Gilgamesh managed to recover, the closest any mortal ever came to touching what the gods kept for themselves, was taken by the creature the ancient world associated with regeneration and endless life. And Gilgamesh sat down on the bank of that pool and wept, not from grief this time, from the specific exhaustion of a person who has gone further than any human being should go to solve an unsolvable problem and arrive back exactly where he started. He goes home. He returns to Uruk. And what the tablet says he does when he gets there is the part that has been sitting quietly at the end of this story for 4,000 years, without nearly enough attention. He looks at the walls of his city, the walls he built, and he describes them. He describes the brickwork, the craftsmanship, the foundations. He walks a man he has brought with him around the perimeter of the city and tells him to look at it. And what the tablet is doing in those final lines, what the Sumerians were saying about fear and mortality and the terror of things that have not happened yet, is this: the walls will outlast him. The city will outlast him. What a person builds, what they leave behind in the physical world, continues after the person ends. And that is not immortality. It is not what Gilgamesh was looking for. It is significantly less than what he wanted, but it is what is actually available. And the tablet ends there, with a king who went to the end of the world to solve the problem of human mortality and came back to look at his own city walls. The Sumerians were not saying that building things cures the fear of death. They were saying that the fear of things that have not yet happened is the specific human torment that no amount of achievement, no amount of power, no amount of searching in the wilderness can resolve. You carry it, and the only honest response to carrying it is to build something anyway, to go back to the city anyway, to walk the walls you made and understand that the best answer available to you is continuation, not resolution, not comfort, not the answer Gilgamesh was looking for, just the walls, still standing, still yours, for now. The tablet that George Smith read in that room in November 1872 did not just predate the Bible's flood story by 1,000 years. It predated every modern understanding of anxiety, mortality, and the specific fear of things that have not happened yet by the same margin. 4,000 years ago, a Sumerian scribe watched a king fall apart, not from what happened to him, but from the knowledge of what was eventually going to happen to him, and wrote it all down, not as philosophy, not as a warning, as an observation, as if to say, "We saw this, we know what it is, you are not the first person to feel it, and you will not be the last." That is either the oldest comfort in human history, or just the oldest honest acknowledgement of the thing, depending on what you needed to hear. George Smith, 32 years old, a self-taught former printer's apprentice in a room in the British Museum, read it and lost his mind with excitement. He had good reason to. He had found something that was going to outlast him, and it did. If this is the kind of history that does something to you at 3 a.m, subscribe and stay close. Because the next tablet in this series describes what the Sumerians said is waiting on the other side of the fear. And they did not make it comfortable either.